So I believe we're going to talk today about communicating with confidence, which is something that we think about all the time with our clients in clinical practice. So my specialty is voice and voice-related communication challenges or disorders, and I also work with people to optimise their vocal function. So when we think about communicating with confidence, that means lots of different things to different people. So as a speech pathologist, one of the first things we have to do is establish what it is that people need. In my clinical practice, we actually work with a lot of clients who are changing their gender identity. Mostly the clients that we see are sort of what we call transitioning from a male identified gender to a female identified gender. Now, there's lots of different terminology around the process and about our clients' sort of perception of what their gender is. Sometimes they call themselves, consider themselves as having a non-binary gender, as opposed to obviously a female or a male type of gender identification. One of the first things we actually have to do with our clients in this space is establish what their perception of what they want to convey about themselves using their voice and how they see their transition or their reviewing or their reconstructing or re-identifying or whatever it is, the way that they want to describe it. So the first thing we need to do is have a conversation about what it is that they're wanting and how they see that and what that looks like for them. So one particular client who I worked with many years ago now, who still stands out in my mind, came to me still living as what we call cisgendered male, but at the age of 40 was very clear that this was now the time to transition to a female identified gender. Having now worked with many transgendered and non-binary identifying clients, it's an eye-opening and very profoundly humbling honour, really, as a clinician, to hear all of the challenges that people go through in dealing with the aspects of coming to terms with who they actually want to be. So I do remember this client who came to me. Let's call him David. And David, when we met, described a tumultuous life of cycling from a male role to a female role internally, sort of wanting to dress as a woman and be out in the world in a woman, but too very frightened to do so, fearful of parental criticism. So would do it all in secret and in hiding, and then when he left home, he would dress up at home, and then he would feel so terribly ashamed of that. He would then, sort of divest himself of all of his female attire and makeup and everything, and then go into what he described as a hyper-masculine phase, where he would go to the gym and work out and this, that, and the other. So this had been his pattern all of his life. He was very socially isolated, pretty much just went to work, didn't really have any friends, but very driven and very focused. And so when we first met, he was just very clear that he just started on hormone therapy, and he wanted to change his voice and he wanted it to happen quickly. So we worked together for 3 months, and in my clinical practice we record the voice every time we meet. Mind you, this was very early on in my clinical practice, so I didn't necessarily replay back every time the recording from the previous session or reflect back to the original recording. And so we worked together for 3 months, and in that time so many things changed for David, because, and not only physically, but we came to know her by her female name, and we'll maybe call her Daphne for this purpose. And Daphne essentially went from being dressed as a male, very much engaged in in, you know, in the full requirement of physical transitioning, so had multiple surgeries. So we worked on a series of voice exercises over these 3 months designed to raise her pitch, make her voice clearer so it worked more efficiently and effortlessly, and to start to change the resonance so that it wasn't a deep, heavy chest resonance. Because when David started, he had a very deep, rumbly voice, which was never going to be able to what we call pass unless that resonance changed to a much higher, lighter resonance. Because she had decided that she would save a big period of leave, and in that period of leave she would leave as David, she would go and have a gender reassignment surgery overseas, and then she would come back as Daphne as a new person. And she was very fortunate. She had a very supportive employer. She worked for a large corporation, and they had a very, very well developed and well researched human resources policy around dealing with it. She came in and she said, "Can we listen to the first recording and compare it to today?" And I was a bit terrified because we'd been listening to comparisons of session by session. We hadn't actually compared from 3 months prior to now. And I was a bit terrified, thinking, oh, maybe she hasn't made very much progress over that period of time. And, you know, she was not sure, and I was not sure by this stage too, because once you get to know somebody, it's very difficult to make an unbiased judgment about how other people will immediately respond to the sound of the voice. Because you get to know the person, you don't get to know the voice. And so I'll never forget it. I played the first recording and I hadn't listened back to it for 3 months. And out came this big, deep, booming, rumbly voice. And then we played back the recording we'd made that day, and here was this higher, lighter, very, very different voice that was now quite androgynous and difficult to place. And I just remember we both sat there and went, wow, like, hello. And that was just, she had just come in, I put the microphone on, we just had a chat. So she wasn't trying, because that just happened through her doing her exercises. And she was very, very dedicated and committed and did everything I asked her to do. And look, it wasn't perfect, and you know, it wasn't like we'd waved a magic wand, and she had this amazingly beautiful, undeniably feminine voice. That was sort of always going to be a bit of a challenge asking her to do that at that age. But I just remember the look on her face of going, wow, like, look how far we've come and look at what's happened. And she now identifies not as a woman, but as a trans woman. So she's now completely embraced her transition and her journey. And she doesn't, every now and then she'll say, oh, I need to work on my voice. And I go, I don't think you do. Because your voice is now your completely authentic voice. And, you know, for people who want to be identified or want to be gendered by their voice immediately, which is completely reasonable and often what people ask for, sometimes that's easy to achieve and sometimes that's very difficult to achieve. And we have to use real life, very safe mechanisms to test that. So, for example, I use the David Jones test because the big departments, the big older style department stores, when you ring them up, the receptionists are trained to say sir or madam, which means they have to gender you by your voice. So if you ring up and somebody says sir or madam, they've made a gender decision. If they don't say anything, they're not sure. So we often use those little types of mechanisms to really help people sort of check where they're at externally in how the, you know, people in the external world might perceive them. But I have to say, over the years, not only with the transgender population or the non-binary population, but certainly with people with voice disorder in general, and especially performers. When the voice goes into disorder or it doesn't meet the needs of the speaker, it either doesn't sound the way they want it to sound, or it's painful, or it cuts out and means you can't do your job. The sense of failure, shame, disappointment, the loss of confidence is enormous and very, very difficult to quantify. And in fact, you know, this is where the work of the Australian Dysphonia Network in really supporting people who have now lived with chronic voice disorder is fantastic, because that loss of confidence in yourself is such a big part of the voice disorder, and it has a massive impact. And in the process of helping somebody rehabilitate their voice and get them back to what they expect their voice to be able to do for them, what I've found over 20 years of clinical practice is we remediate the voice well before we remediate confidence. So it takes a lot longer for people to get their confidence back than it takes to remediate the actual voice. The good news is, though, certainly in my field, we get resolution for the vast majority of the people that we work with. And helping people who even live with chronic voice disorder to try and regain that confidence is still a very satisfying, sometimes difficult, but really valuable part of what we do in the job.